Golden Age celebrities were all in the money when they were popular. Once they went out of limelight, things totally changed. Many of them not just died in debt, also had to live on roads. We are going to cover 27 more Golden Age celebrities who either died in debt, poor, or on roads. Bela Lugosi. Famed for portraying Dracula in 1931, Lugosi enjoyed early stardom but struggled later due to typecasting, multiple divorces, and drug addiction. He resorted to low-budget films just to pay bills, and by his death in 1956, he had almost nothing to show for his work. Reportedly only about $1,900 in the bank and $1,000 in property. His family was so strapped that they couldn't afford his funeral. Family friend Frank Sinatra quietly paid for it, underscoring how poor Lugosi had become at the end. Marie Prevost. Popular silent film star of the 1920s, Prevost saw her career falter with the advent of sound and personal tragedies. She descended into alcoholism and crash dieting, trying to recapture her fame. By the time she died in 1937 at age 38, the official cause was acute alcoholism and malnutrition. Heartbreakingly, her body was found days later in a cramped apartment, and she had left a promissory note owing fellow actress Joan Crawford $110. Crawford ultimately paid for Prevost's funeral, highlighting how little money Marie had left. Veronica Lake. A Hollywood femme fatale of the 1940s known for her peekaboo hairstyle, Lake's fortunes declined in the 1950s due to alcoholism and mental health issues. She declared bankruptcy and even had her home seized by the IRS for back taxes. By 1962, a reporter discovered her living in a cheap hotel and working as a cocktail lounge waitress under an alias. Though she denied being destitute, Lake was clearly struggling financially. She died in 1973 at age 50, largely forgotten, with her final years spent drifting between inexpensive hotels and odd jobs to make ends meet. Charlie Bird Parker. A pioneering bebop musician, Parker revolutionized jazz in the 1940s, but struggled with heroin and alcohol addiction that wrecked his finances and health. He earned significant money at his peak, but his habit led him to squander it. He was constantly out of cash, often pawning his saxophones to buy drugs. By the time of his death in 1955, at just 34, Parker was in a pitiable state. He died in a friend's apartment, severely ill and malnourished, and his appearance was so deceiving that the coroner thought the 34-year-old was in his 50s. Bird left behind no savings or assets of note, only a musical legacy, as his years of hard living had drained him financially as well as physically. H.P. Lovecraft. Now hailed as an iconic horror writer, Lovecraft died unknown and impoverished. He struggled to make a living from his writing in the 1920s to 30s. He moved into ever smaller lodging with his aunt and suffered from malnutrition. He succumbed to intestinal cancer in 1937 at age 46, weakened by his poor diet and living conditions. Lovecraft's estate was essentially worthless when he died. His genius was only recognized posthumously. But during his final days, he literally starved alongside battling illness, illustrating the depth of his poverty. Zora Neale Hurston. A major figure of the Harlem Renaissance, Hurston authored Their Eyes Were Watching God, 1937, and other classics. But after her literary fame faded, she spent her later years in severe financial distress, working as a maid and substitute teacher. In the late 1950s, she suffered a stroke and had to enter a county welfare home. Hurston died in 1960 at age 69. She was even buried in an unmarked grave because no funds were available for a headstone. Her grave remained unmarked until 1973, when author Alice Walker purchased a marker. At the time of her death, an AP obituary noted Hurston had died in obscurity and poverty, which sadly sums up her final chapter. Jack Kerouac. The Beat Generation writer who achieved fame with On the Road, 1957, never managed his finances well and drank heavily. By the 1960s, Kerouac was living with his mother, estranged from many friends, and his income had dried up. When he died in 1969 at age 47, from internal bleeding caused by alcoholism, his entire estate was valued at a shockingly low $91. It took decades for his royalties and manuscripts to accumulate posthumous value. In life, he saw little financial reward, leaving only a few dollars and lots of unpublished work behind. Leonard Chico Marx. As part of the Marx Brothers, Chico enjoyed huge success in vaudeville and Hollywood in the 1930s. However, his lifelong compulsive gambling devoured his earnings. He squandered a fortune on betting and had to keep performing long after his brothers retired comfortably, just to pay gambling debts. By the end of his life, he died in 1961 at 74, having lost nearly everything he'd made. His story is a cautionary tale. Despite years of fame and high income, left him nearly destitute in his final years. Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson, a man of extraordinary talent and passion, rose to fame as both a singer and an actor. But his later years were marked by a relentless struggle against financial ruin. Despite having once commanded respect on the stage and screen, Robeson's career took a drastic turn during the McCarthy era. Blacklisted and shunned by many of the very institutions that had once celebrated him, his income evaporated almost overnight. You can imagine the pain of being sidelined for political reasons when all you've known is the applause of millions. With his reputation tarnished by government suspicion and public fear, Robeson was forced to accept meager payments for sporadic performances and lectures. His lifelong commitment to civil rights came at the cost of financial security, leaving him with mounting debts that he could never clear. The irony is that the very passion that once lit up concert halls became the reason for his financial downfall. Robeson was forced to live a quiet life in relative poverty, far removed from the exuberance of his earlier days. Friends and colleagues remember him as a dignified, gentle soul who never gave up on his ideals, even as money became scarce. Alan Ladd. Alan Ladd was the epitome of Hollywood cool in the 1950s, best known for his role in Shane and other classic westerns, yet his personal life told a very different story. Behind that suave demeanor was a man battling inner demons, including bouts of depression and a dependency on alcohol that gradually undermined his financial stability. Despite the high earnings of his peak years, Ladd's lavish lifestyle and a series of ill-advised business decisions drained his bank account. As he grew older, his once commanding presence on screen diminished, and the roles that had once brought him millions dried up. With mounting medical expenses and personal debts spiraling out of control, Alan Ladd found himself increasingly unable to maintain the extravagant lifestyle he once enjoyed. His struggles were compounded by failed investments and the emotional toll of multiple tumultuous relationships. Ladd's financial woes became public as his agents and advisors scrambled to manage the debts that threatened to overshadow his legacy. In the end, even the bright lights of Hollywood couldn't stave off the relentless pressures of debt and declining health. Alan Ladd's final years were spent in relative obscurity, far removed from the glamour of his heyday, and when he passed away, it was clear that the debts he had accumulated were a heavy burden he could not escape. Lillian Roth. Imagine a star whose early promise lit up Broadway and the silver screen, only to watch that glitter fade into shadow. This is the story of Lillian Roth. In the heyday of her career during the 1930s, Roth dazzled audiences with her talent and beauty. But behind the scenes, she faced personal battles that slowly eroded her financial well-being. Lillian's struggle with alcoholism was well documented, and it wasn't long before the lavish lifestyle she once enjoyed turned into a nightmare of unpaid bills and mounting debts. As she tried to cling to fame, her personal life spiraled out of control, leaving her financially and emotionally bankrupt. Despite a brief resurgence with a best-selling memoir that told her tragic tale, the money was never enough to mend the deep-seated financial wounds. Friends recall how she once joked, with a bittersweet tone, that the applause on stage was the only sound louder than her creditors' knock. In her final years, Lillian Roth was forced to live in modest conditions, far removed from the glamour that once defined her. When she died, it wasn't with the fanfare of a celebrated star, but in relative obscurity and poverty, a poignant end to a life that had seen both dazzling highs. John Drew Barrymore. John Drew Barrymore, scion of the famous Barrymore acting dynasty, was expected to inherit not just a legacy of brilliance, but also the wealth that accompanied it. Yet life took an unexpected turn. Despite early signs of promise and the illustrious family name behind him, John Drew struggled mightily with addiction and self-destructive behaviors. The pressures of living up to a family legacy, coupled with a string of personal and professional missteps, left him in a downward spiral. Chronic substance abuse and volatile relationships led to a series of failed ventures and mounting debts. As his career faltered, so did his financial security. Friends recount how John Drew would often talk about how the money never seemed to last. Despite coming from a storied family, he was left fighting to pay off creditors and even basic bills. By the time he passed away, he had long been forgotten by the industry that once adored him. His passing in relative obscurity was a painful reminder that even the weight of a legendary name can't shield one from the perils of addiction and mismanagement. Tierney. Tierney, celebrated for her ethereal beauty and magnetic screen presence in films like Leave Her to Heaven and Laura, led a life that seemed destined for eternal glamour. Yet behind the luminous facade was a woman battling inner turmoil and mounting financial pressures. Despite earning big during her peak years, Tierney's later life was marked by a series of personal and professional setbacks that slowly eroded her financial security. Her struggles with mental health, compounded by a tumultuous personal life, led to bouts of depression that affected her decision-making and career choices. Over time, Tierney found herself making choices that, while perhaps artistically driven, disastrous for her bank account. Failed investments and extravagant spending habits meant that her once comfortable lifestyle turned precarious. As the years went on, the steady stream of high-paying roles evaporated. Despite her best efforts to revive her career, the industry that had once celebrated her luminous talent now offered only sporadic, meager opportunities. Barbara Marr. Barbara Marr was once hailed as the girl who is too beautiful, a silent film star whose striking looks and vivacious energy captured the hearts of moviegoers in the 1920s. Behind the glamour was a tempestuous personal life. Known for living large and spending lavishly, Marr's lifestyle quickly outpaced her earnings. With a penchant for extravagant parties and a string of scandalous romances, she racked up debts that she could never hope to repay. Despite her early success and the allure of Hollywood stardom, Barbara found herself in an inescapable spiral of financial ruin. As the silent film era faded and sound films took over, her once promising career evaporated almost overnight. The money that had once flowed so freely was replaced by mounting bills and loans, and the debts became a constant, crushing presence in her life. Friends recall how she would lament that the glitter of Hollywood could not pay for the cost of living in a world. Jane Mansfield. Jane Mansfield was the quintessential sex symbol of the 1950s. A vivacious performer whose blonde bombshell persona captured the imagination of millions. Yet behind that dazzling smile was a woman whose financial life was in constant turmoil. Despite earning huge sums in her heyday, Mansfield's lavish spending habits and the high cost of maintaining her glamorous image led her down a dangerous path. She splurged on extravagant homes, luxurious cars, designer wardrobes, believing that she could always out-earn her expenses. The entertainment industry is fickle, and as the roles dried up, so did her income. Her debts began to pile up. fueled by a string of poor business decisions and legal entanglements. Even as she continued to work on films and stage shows, the money she made barely kept pace with her mounting obligations. Friends recall her frustration, being unable to escape the cycle of spending and debt, a cycle that seemed to swallow every cent she earned. In the end, the very excess that made her a star became her undoing. Tex Ritter. Tex Ritter, a beloved country singer and actor, once brought joy to audiences with his deep, resonant voice and rugged charm. In the early days of his career, he was a shining example of the American dream, a self-made star who rose from humble beginnings to command respect on radio and film. However, as the years went by, Tex's financial fortunes took a harsh turn. Despite his early successes, he fell victim to the pitfalls of overspending and poor investment decisions. His love for the finer things in life, fast cars, country estates, and expensive gadgets, eventually outweighed the earnings from his performances. As the music industry evolved and new talents emerged, Tex found himself struggling to secure the lucrative contracts that had once been his staple. Friends say he often joked about his rich-poor status, rich in talent but poor in money. Gloria Grahame, known for her sultry voice and smoldering on-screen presence in films like The Big Heat, once dazzled audiences with her impeccable talent. Yet behind the glamour lay a life beset by personal and financial struggles. Gloria's early career brought her significant earnings, but a series of tumultuous relationships and bad investments slowly drained her bank account. As Hollywood's tastes shifted, so did her fortunes. Roles became scarcer, and the projects she landed paid only a pittance compared to her earlier successes, taking on smaller parts and even television work to keep the lights on. But over time, the weight of unpaid bills and mounting debts became overwhelming. Friends recall her candid admissions of frustration. Her health and spirits waned as financial pressures mounted, and by the time she passed away in the early 1980s, Gloria Grahame was a shadow of the vibrant star she had once been. Frances Farmer. Frances Farmer's life is one of Hollywood's most enduring tragedies, a tale of extraordinary talent, crushed under the weight of mental illness and financial ruin. Once a promising actress in the 1930s and 1940s, Frances was celebrated for her fiery performances, but as the pressures of fame mounted, so did her personal demons. Plagued by depression and erratic behavior, she became a magnet for scandal and tabloid headlines, which only deepened her financial woes. Her once promising career was derailed by a series of unfortunate events, and the money she earned evaporated in the chaos of legal battles. Even when she attempted a comeback, industry had moved on. Frances Farmer's life spiraled into a tragic cycle of misfortune, leaving her penniless and forgotten by the very audience that once adored her. Robert Walker. Robert Walker was once touted as one of Hollywood's promising young actors, lighting up screens with his charm and rugged good looks in films that captivated audiences of the 1950s. Yet behind the confident exterior lay a life of mounting financial burdens and personal demons. Walker's rapid rise was halted by struggles with substance abuse and the pressures of living up to enormous expectations. Poor financial decisions, spending lavishly on parties, expensive habits, and a lifestyle that outpaced his earnings, led him down a path of deep debt. As his career faltered, so did his bank balance. The money that once flowed freely began to dry up, leaving him to grapple with unpaid bills and loans he couldn't manage. Friends and colleagues later recalled how Robert's promising talent was overshadowed by his inability to control his personal affairs. His life became a cautionary tale of what happens when talent and opportunity are squandered by self-destruction. William Holden. William Holden, a name synonymous with classic Hollywood, once ruled the silver screen in hits like Sunset Boulevard and Stalag 17. Behind the accolades and on-screen charisma, Holden's later years were marred by financial instability and personal challenges. Despite having earned millions during his career, A series of poor business ventures, divorces, and an increasingly expensive lifestyle gradually depleted his fortune, struggled in private with mounting debt and the heavy burden of financial mismanagement. As his health declined and roles became fewer, the money that once flowed into his bank account slowed to a trickle. Friends recall him lamenting about the price of living in a world that once celebrated him, a world where even a celebrated actor could be undone by the simple realities of life. In his final years, William Holden was forced to take on smaller projects and cameo roles just to keep up with his bills, a far cry from the blockbuster stardom of his youth. Carl Switzer, better known as Alfalfa from the Our Gang comedies, was once the adorable centerpiece of a beloved series that captured the hearts of audiences across America. But the story of his later life is one of heart-wrenching decline. As a child star, Carl earned significant money, yet as he grew older, the magic of his early fame evaporated. Struggling to transition from child star to adult roles, he found himself cast aside by an industry that had no place for him once the novelty wore off. With few opportunities and mounting financial obligations, Carl's earnings dwindled dramatically, and an inability to escape the shadow of his former on-screen persona. The debts he accumulated, stemming from bad investments, an unwise lifestyle, and the high costs of maintaining a public image. Friends recall how, in his later years, haunted by the memory of his early success, tragically, Carl Switzer's life ended in a violent manner. He was fatally shot in a dispute while trying to collect a debt. His death marked a tragic end to a life that once brought joy to so many. A stark reminder of the cruel twists that can turn childhood fame. Margaret Sullavan. Margaret Sullavan, with her warm smile and captivating presence, was once one of Hollywood's cherished leading ladies. Known for her performances in films that blended wit with heartfelt emotion, she charmed audiences during the 1930s. Yet behind the scenes, Sullavan faced a relentless struggle that slowly eroded her financial stability. Personal demons, including bouts of depression and a series of tumultuous relationships, led her down a path of financial mismanagement. Despite earning handsome sums in her prime, she made a series of unwise investments. Friends often remarked on how the pressures of maintaining her image and legacy, as the roles and opportunities dwindled with time, the money that once flowed freely became scarce, and she found herself trapped in a cycle of mounting bills and overdue payments. In her later years, Margaret Sullavan's financial woes became impossible to hide. Her once elegant life gave way to a series of modest circumstances that were a far cry from the glamour of her youth. When she finally succumbed to the pressures that had long weighed on her, it was in an atmosphere of quiet despair and financial ruin. Wallace Reid. Wallace Reid was one of the early bright lights of silent cinema, a matinee idol who once drew crowds to theaters by the thousands. In the 1910s, he epitomized the promise of Hollywood, with handsome looks and a magnetic screen presence that captured the public's imagination. But as time passed, tragedy struck in the form of chronic pain and dependency on morphine. An injury led him down a dark road of addiction, and soon, the very substance that was meant to ease his suffering became the cause of his downfall. Wallace Reid's escalating dependency drained his finances, as he spent lavishly on drugs and treatment that ultimately left him broke. Despite once commanding handsome salaries and enjoying a lifestyle of luxury, his debts mounted rapidly as he tried desperately to maintain his health and his image. In the end, his body and bank account were both ravaged by the relentless toll of addiction. Reid's life, once filled with promise and adoration, ended in a sanitarium where he died penniless and largely forgotten. His tragic story is a reminder that early success and stardom can quickly fade when faced with the brutal realities of addiction and financial mismanagement. A cautionary tale from the very beginnings of Hollywood. Tellegen. Tellegen, a matinee idol of the 1920s, was celebrated for his striking looks and commanding screen presence. Yet behind the glamorous veneer lay a life marred by turbulent relationships and catastrophic financial missteps. Tellegen's early success in silent films earned him widespread acclaim. But as the industry evolved, so did the personal and financial challenges he faced. Known for his extravagant tastes, he invested heavily in a lifestyle that demanded constant upkeep. Lavish homes, expensive clothing, and a series of indulgent social outings. Over time, these extravagances took their toll. Bad investments and a string of personal scandals led to a rapid depletion of his wealth. As creditors began to circle, Tellegen found himself unable to repay the debts that mounted. His financial decline was further compounded by legal battles and the ostracism that followed personal controversies. Despite his once dazzling popularity, the fall from grace was swift. Lou Tellegen's life ended in despair. His suicide in 1934 marked the tragic culmination of years spent in financial and emotional turmoil. His legacy remains a stark example of how a life built on charm and beauty can unravel into a story of isolation and ruin. Peg Entwistle. Peg Entwistle's story is perhaps one of the most tragic chapters in Hollywood's history, a tale of a young actress whose dreams crumbled under the weight of financial and emotional pressure. Once heralded as a rising star, Entwistle struggled to make a breakthrough in an industry that quickly chewed up and spat out its hopefuls. Despite her early promise and brief moments of spotlight, the harsh realities of show business soon caught up with her. Mounting debts, sparse opportunities, and the constant pressure to maintain a glamorous image left her feeling isolated and hopeless. Peg's financial struggles were compounded by personal demons and the relentless scrutiny of a public that expected perfection. With her earnings dwindling and creditors looming large, she found herself in an unendurable state of despair. Peg Entwistle chose to end her life by leaping from the Hollywood sign, a stark, desperate act that symbolized the collapse of her dreams. Her untimely death remains a haunting reminder of the dark underside of Hollywood glamour.